On the front lines, every decision matters. That's why Intel partnered with EdgeRunner AI to bring AI where and when our troops need it most. In the field, in real time. EdgeRunner's secure, domain-specific language model is optimized to run on Intel-powered devices, and it's built on Intel's 50-year commitment to advanced manufacturing right here on American soil. That's the power of Intel Inside. See what we can build together at intel.com/USAI.
I'm Ben Watson, and welcome to Defense One Radio. This is what it sounds like when an Iranian-designed Shahed drone flies overhead to attack targets in Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine. Drone attacks are now such an ordinary facet of life in Ukraine that an orchestra in Kyiv recently created a new work they've entitled Shahed. Here's a short clip. Some locals have described as very convincing and very terrifying. After more than 3 years, Russia's Ukraine invasion has stagnated and morphed into a war of drones, with both sides endlessly adapting. In fact, Russia carried out its largest drone attack of the war to date on Sunday, when it launched 810 drones and decoys at various targets. Almost 750 of those drones were allegedly shot down before reaching their targets, according to Ukraine's Air Force. Earlier this year, we discussed several ways the US military in Europe is adapting to what they're seeing in Ukraine. But we haven't quite gotten into the various experiments Russian and Ukrainian developers have openly pursued, since trench warfare grew and front lines largely began to freeze, prompting a rare summit between the leaders of Russia and the US last month in Alaska. So for this episode, I decided to call up Sam Bendett, an advisor in Russia studies at the Virginia-based research organization CNA. He specializes in Russia's military and defense industry, with a focus on robotics and unmanned systems. We've spoken to Sam twice since Russia invaded Ukraine, but it's been about 2 years since we caught up. Sam, welcome back.
Thanks so much. Good to be back, and 2 years is a long time.
I know, there's been so much that has happened. Even though the front lines may not have moved, there have been a lot of things that have happened. I guess off the top of my head, I think about how Ukraine, I think since that time, really started extending its drone attacks and missile attacks and such, various attacks into Russia. That had not been the case when we last talked. By the way, I'm also going to be joined by my colleague, Defense One's Science and Tech editor, Patrick Tucker. He recently visited a U.S. Army base in Indiana where they were carrying out new tests on their drones, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But Sam, I wanted to speak to you because you've been an especially persistent and prolific tracker of Russian-made unmanned systems. And we're talking across the land, the sea, and the air. I keep seeing your posts on LinkedIn, and like nearly all of them could spur a different conversation all on their own. And it was just last week when I was thinking it's been a while since we've had a conversation, so thought I'd call you up. Now, I want to start with aerial drones. Some of the more recent and notable developments, to my mind anyway, include a calendar year's massive growth in fiber optic drones, literally dragging ultra-thin wire all across Ukrainian battlefields to thwart jamming. Now, these are literally drones that are connected to a string, you might say, and that was different from before. And so, for my mind, I was having trouble wrapping my head around how these things exactly work. I know that they let them thwart jamming, like I noted, but I also saw that I think the New York Times had reported the cables have spurred adaptations to tanks, some of which now feature spikes to catch these cables in the field. I think birds are making nests with some of these cables. They're so readily available. I mean, that's kind of remarkable. But you also wrote today about an effort Russian bloggers say uses shit and sticks, which is to say low-end technology like plywood, simple plywood drone that can carry an 8-pound payload more than it looks like about 30 miles or so. At this point, the war in Ukraine has pretty universally been acknowledged as a war of drones. Who can make them the fastest, the most effective? Who can continue war without losing quite so many soldiers? It's an understandable calculus. Ukraine has embraced this to the point of now allowing outsiders to track each of their top drone teams' combat stats in real time. You noted on social media. I didn't know that. So Russia's not letting up, and in fact launched on Sunday its largest drone attack of the war so far. So, my first question, big picture, 30,000 or so foot view. Have you been surprised or impressed by any particular developments or novel tweaks in aerial drones over the last 2 years of this war?
If we zoom out and look at the bigger picture, I think the real issue here are sheer numbers. When we spoke last in 2023, we talked about the use of some of the commercial technologies and some of the commercial drones like Chinese-made DJI quadcopters for reconnaissance intelligence like combat missions. They're still around. We started talking about the evolution and use of long-range UAVs, loading uh, loading munition types, and one-way attack drones. We started talking in 2023 about the move away from more expensive standalone platforms that the war essentially started with, and which essentially remained the norm for UAV and drone forces around the world prior to 2022, towards the use of large-scale, cheap, attritable mass of different types of UAV. So you no longer have to contend with a very expensive cost for a single UAV platform because you are now dealing with multiple platforms that each costs a lot less by itself than a single UAV platform fielded in military combat prior to 2022 by most militaries. So now in 2025, we are talking millions of UAVs. Already in 2024, Ukraine has delivered upwards of around 2 million drones to its forces. Most of them were short-range tactical UAVs. Russia claimed to have delivered up to 1.4 million UAVs. Again, most of them were tactical short-range UAVs, such as FPV drones, quadcopters, and similar types. Both sides are using fixed-wing, long-range UAVs for strikes in depth into the adversary territory. Russia has developed newer versions of the earlier drones that were donated by Iran, and these new versions feature improved engines, improved command and control, improved capabilities, just larger numbers in general. Ukraine is keeping pace. It is launching different long-range types deep inside Russia and is actually starting to hurt Russia's energy infrastructure and key infrastructure and strategic targets that feed Russia's military war effort. You mentioned fiber optic drones. They were not in the picture when we talked last in 2023. In fact, 2023 really didn't have a lot of FPV drones either. This technology just started to get experimented with on the battlefield. And so, if anything, again, I think I'm surprised by the sheer numbers. No official military document, no official military doctrine written before 2022 in the West or elsewhere has considered that there could be millions of potential targets incoming at the soldiers in combat. Millions, as in millions of different types of UAVs, drones, and loading munitions and similar targets. You mentioned that soldiers at the front are experimenting with DIY type of technologies, and that's still the norm. I think we mentioned that in 2023 as both Ukrainian and Russian militaries were experimenting and adopting commercial technology for military applications, including Chinese-made DJI drones, which are still very much ubiquitous at the front. But a lot of soldiers in Russia, in Ukraine, essentially started making their own technology solutions. They were assembling their own UAVs and similar unmanned systems, which I hope to get to in this conversation later on. And so the commercial technology that enables a lot of these developments is actually making it possible for soldiers to assemble a tactical working UAV at the front that will feature a working camera, a sensor package, an engine, and everything else that's needed for that drone to fly. And oftentimes, soldiers are using technology that's just readily available for them. These are not military-grade UAVs. They don't go through military certification. They are made, as the Russians call it, iz говна и палок, or from shit and sticks. In other words, a real DIY platform. But years into this conflict, it is now possible to assemble something quickly, efficiently, from readily available components and equip it with dual-use commercial technologies that can enable this UAV to be quite lethal. And this is where we find ourselves in 2025. There's a lot of military-grade technology that's built for strikes in depth and at the tactical edge. But there's also a lot of dual use and commercially inspired technologies, which are, again, feeding this drone surge, with most of the FPV drones used by Russian and Ukrainian forces still made from commercial components. And as I just mentioned, soldiers on both sides experimenting with DIY type efforts to actually produce working prototypes and concepts that they need right there and then.
Yeah. I will say one terrifying development that I saw, and maybe it's been going on for a while, but I had read Ukraine had pioneered this. Features aerial drones dropping thermite bombs or incendiary munitions to clear entire forested regions where the Russians are hiding. And when I say clear, I mean like burn it all to the ground and fairly quickly. Russia has adopted the use of this as well, but it is wild to observe in videos these drones at work burning whole chunks of Ukraine like Germans march to the, or like General Sherman's march to the sea. It's remarkable to observe, but again, maybe that had been going on for a while. I don't know, but if something is dropping thermite from above, it's really terrifying to observe.
That was also a development that was dictated by the necessity to clear small forest areas and tree plantings from adversary soldiers. And so at a certain point in the summer, in the spring, and early fall, when there's lots of foliage, it is possible to use these thermite drones. They're not quite as ubiquitous now as they were before. I think there's been a switch to fiber optic UAVs, as well as more radio-controlled UAVs with more experienced pilots that can navigate through basically any terrain at this point. But you're right. It was actually, for soldiers on the ground, it was quite terrifying because everything burned. And oftentimes the arrival of this drone was quite a surprise. This, of course, gave birth to countermeasures. And each particular drone development in this conflict, as has been recorded by numerous scholars and researchers, by Ukrainians themselves and by Russians, of course, gave birth to yet another version of the countermeasure. So each drone success gave birth to a counter drone success. So technologies aimed at countering different types of UAVs with different measures are keeping pace with all kinds of terrifying tactical and operational drone developments in this war.
Patrick Tucker has joined us. Patrick, how are you this afternoon?
Wonderful, always wonderful. Beautiful day out here in this fantastic, brave new world that is being forged all around us. So I'm doing great, and great to see you, Sam. Been a long time, but it's been busy out there.
Likewise, it's been incredibly busy.
Yeah, that's always good. When like journalists and like national security technology thinkers are very busy, that's not usually a good sign for humanity. But this is a fascinating topic. There's a lot going on here, so it's great to be here.
You know, I always wondered, and this is something I bring up with my family all the time when they wonder about just this avalanche of negative news about the war or just about the conflicts in general. What would happen if we had internet, mobile phones, and social media a century earlier? Let's say around World War I, what kind of information would we post and discuss and debate about the technologies that we saw in that particular conflict, which gave birth to so many different techs and tactics that we are utilizing today? And I bring this up because in previous conversations, I made the comparisons between the evolution of drone warfare in Ukraine and the evolution of air power in World War I, because air power in World War I started with very simple biplanes where pilots dropped grenades literally from their cabins on top of the enemy. They were conducting simple intelligence and reconnaissance missions, and then somebody put a machine gun on the plane, and suddenly we had a fighter and an interceptor, and then we built large bomber aircraft that had to be protected by their own escort aircraft. And so all of a sudden, we have this rapid evolution of air power from a single aircraft that did everything into very specialized forms and very specialized versions of aircraft that did their own thing in combat. And that's what we're witnessing right now in Ukraine. We have a specialization of different types of multi-rotor and fixed-wing UAVs into intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, combat, mining, demining, signal repeater mission, logistics, supply, electronic warfare, and other types of missions as well.
Yeah, I think it is fascinating when you look at the comparison between World War I and the things that we associated with it, sort of historically, trench warfare, sides that are literally fighting over inches, and the role that early aircraft played in that, mostly as ISR platforms. And then you go back to the way the Russians were using drones in 2014, very much for that similar purpose as ISR, to find Ukrainian positions and wiping out an entire Ukrainian tank battalion very quickly. The comparison, like the similarity, is sort of striking, but the evolution pace is for this is matching the evolution pace of all information technology. So it expands exponentially as information technology expands. One breakthrough doesn't beget two, begets three, begets four. It's one begets two, begets four, begets eight. And so the evolution here is incredibly fast. But right now we are in this bizarre sort of like World War I Part Two moment, as opposed to like World War II, where we're repeating some of the same concepts of operation, except robotically, from the First World War, but we're still fighting over inches, right? We're still in this like weird static conflict. And I think that that's something that's really fascinating about this. And it reminds me of something that the new head of European Command said fairly recently, which is he just sort of pointed out, and it was significant because he pointed this out just a couple of days before Ukraine reached its big milestone of having delivered 1 million drones to the front line. Some of those were drones that were provided by the U.S., but they were still delivered. But the Ukrainian capability to develop them has really gone up. But what the head of Eurocom pointed out is that these things aren't providing air dominance. There's no air dominance in this theater right now. What there is are two forces, one of which should have been obliterated, that's been able to deny air superiority to the other, and that's the role that the drones are effectively playing. So even as these innovation cycles are pushing people like on the front line, they're operators, they're some very creative and hardworking contractors that are actually partnering with Ukraine. They're adapting innovation cycles much faster, and it seems very fast. But the overall effect is what you see, like a strange sort of stasis that happens because what the democratization of technology has allowed is the erosion of an advantage that used to be a decisive advantage. Now that's just sort of gone. So I think that's sort of fascinating and sort of telling. And it's obviously a status quo that won't last forever.
Right. And as you have mentioned, it's sort of this World War I redux. In fact, there are a lot of similarities between trench warfare in World War I and today's conflict. But as we have witnessed with the evolution of tactics and the fast adoption of tactics that work really well, the side that seizes on an opportunity to disrupt the other's logistics and supplies can actually achieve a lot. Whether or not it's going to seize on that opportunity remains to be seen. But there's been a lot of concern, for example, in Ukraine, that Russia's Rubicon Center, which is its elite drone units, which are probably going to form the core of the coming unmanned systems forces that Russia will unveil soon, probably in a matter of months or within several months. These units have been able to disrupt Ukrainian supply and logistics in the Kursk region, and are doing so in eastern Ukraine as well. And once your supply and logistics are disrupted, it is very difficult to remain on the front line in a static position, because then you have to reposition yourself, and that can open up the opportunity for small groups of enemy fighters to seep through and actually form their own salient. And so this war is basically these little salients, which are formed by very small groups of people, as you said, over inches, but inches can add up over a very long period of time.
Yeah. So is this new Russian core, are they doing anything that's sort of fundamentally different from, I mean, obviously there's new tactics for surviving in a really contested electronic warfare environment that everybody is employing, and that involves autonomy, it involves fiber optics, it involves all this other stuff. But in terms of actually creating a new capability for drones, is this new core doing that, or is it just sort of another step in the evolution of the progression that we've already seen? Because they were always, like, everybody was always targeting supply lines. This is now just a new step that allows Russia to perhaps do that a little bit better. But what is this new core really going to do? Is it really an innovation, and does Ukraine have like a counterpart to it?
Well, yes. In fact, Russian actions are mirror imaging what Ukraine has done already. Ukraine launched its unmanned systems forces late last year. It was the first country in the world to actually dedicate an entire military branch to the development and incorporation of unmanned systems in the larger military force. And so Russians followed suit with their own announcement in December of last year that they will unveil their own forces. And they are trying to do so again in this, as they said, in this upcoming quarter. So I would say within the next couple months. What this force intends to do is to essentially organize the disparate level of technology acquisition experience that now is prevalent across the Russian front. There are elite units like Rubicon, there are regular UAV units. The quality of drone pilots varies significantly. The quality of drone technologies varies significantly as well. There's still plenty of dual use DIY type of tech at the front. There's a zoo of different technologies that exists amongst the Russian UAV forces, just like on the Ukrainian side. So Russians want to consolidate, want to organize this momentum and create a branch that would be able to incorporate tactics and lessons learned and standardize a lot of technologies and a lot of tactics that already exist at the front. And I think Rubicon Center is going to lead the way in this as Russia's best and most capable UAV force.
Okay. I want to obviously not bet on Ben too much, but I'm curious about that thing that General Alexis Grinkowicz, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, but he's the new commander of U.S. European Command. The thing that he said that what he's seeing right now is that drones, even as the innovation cycles get faster because it's evenly matched, they don't produce air superiority. What would be the route to producing air superiority, given that the dynamics that you just mentioned don't really change, even though the innovations themselves are fascinating, the general dynamics are the same. What would air superiority with drones actually look like if it was achievable?
Well, according to numerous statements by Ukrainians, by Russians, it's the availability of long-range strike capacity that targets the enemy in depth and targets the enemy deep in the rear and disrupts the enemy's ability to wage war at the front. And so that's what Ukrainians are doing right now with strikes on Russian oil and energy infrastructure, disrupting the rail link, and trying to disrupt Russian logistics and supplies. Again, in turn, Russians are doing the same and quite effectively against some Ukrainian formations by disrupting Ukrainian supply and logistics. And this is enabled by FPV drones that can now range up to 20, 30 kilometers on radio channels with signal repeaters. It's enabled by fiber optic UAVs that can range up to 40 kilometers on their own, deep inside one's territory that used to be really under the direct control of the combatants, right? We're talking like 25 miles from the actual line of contact. And that's enabled by long-range strikes, both at the civilian and energy infrastructure, which is also conducted by both sides. Right now, the adversaries are more or less evenly matched in one form or another, and neither side is giving in. And I think each side is trying to come up with a breakthrough with a combination of factors that can utilize UAVs to, again, disrupt the adversary's ability to wage war. And that is impacting industry, logistics, supply, and manpower.
One of the surprising successes of this war for Ukraine has been its work in the, I believe they're called Magura naval drones, like V5, V6, V7, I think of the models. They've helped push back much of Russia's naval fleet in the region. I am wondering, since we're talking about drones, are there any known issues with Ukraine's ability to sort of sustain this edge? And, what can we say about Russia's response from the things you've been able to observe?
Well, until recently, Ukraine had the full advantage, and its unmanned surface vessels, USVs, were striking Russians in port, at sea. They sunk multiple vessels. They have damaged many others and have pushed Russian Black Sea fleet away from its formerly safe havens in Sevastopol and in the Crimea. But as I've indicated with UAVs, every successful action is met with a counteraction, and Russians have been learning. They've actually been learning how to defend themselves against Ukrainian USVs, how to counter them, and they've devised a number of tactics, which include physical countermeasures, kinetic countermeasures, that have been quite effective. I think several months ago, a Ukrainian Navy official has acknowledged that Russians have become very effective in interdicting and identifying Ukrainian USVs. And until recently, Russians have been sort of working diligently trying to develop their own unmanned surface vessels that would be a response to Ukrainian USVs. And they kind of went to the drawing board after 2022. I think after they've captured the first USV that washed ashore, if you remember back, I think it was September of 2022. Ukrainian USVs lost control because it lost its Starlink connection and it washed up in the Crimea. And I think Russians began studying these USVs in earnest. And so now they've actually announced that they have a lineup, at least half a dozen different USVs. They've been practicing how to use them both at sea and in rivers. And they've just sunk a Ukrainian intelligence vessel in the mouth of the Danube River, utilizing their USV in a very similar tactic to what Ukrainians have been doing to the Russian Black Sea Fleet. So Russians also indicated that they can manufacture hundreds of USVs and unleash them at the Ukrainian targets. Of course, Ukrainian targets will be quite different from the Russian ones because Ukraine does not have a large fleet. It does not have many vessels. But Russians intend to field their USVs, at least according to the official statements, as intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms to identify incoming threats, both aerial and maritime, to try and interdict Ukrainian UAVs and USVs, which are bearing on Russian targets or en route to Russian targets. They want to put weapons and systems on their USVs, just like Ukrainians have done, to strike Ukrainian targets at sea and at shore. And so at the same time, there's been a lot of training across the Russian Black Sea Fleet and other fleets on how to deal with incoming maritime and aerial drones. How effective that training is, I do not know, but the Russians have been talking publicly about it. So suffice it to say, this is now very much in everybody's mind across the Russian MOD, and therefore certain tactics are going to be applied downrange with different fleets and different ships.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, so in looking at the problem, the challenge of like really long range strike through drones, it's similar to sort of to, we're talking about hypersonics, the high maneuverability, and that's not a drone per se. You don't need a lot of intelligence in it, but there's something about the idea of like staying in the air for a very long time as sort of a hovering thing and then picking your target, hovering over Russia that is largely like impractical because at some point somebody's going to see you and shoot it down. Whereas long-term autonomy in the sea, so persistence of unmanned naval assets, there have been a lot of different approaches to this over the years, like research-wise and in terms of academically. There was a program called Upward Falling Payloads from DARPA. They basically wanted to put little eggs on the seafloor that would, upon detection of something, launch a little, rise to the surface and launch a thing, launch a little drone or something. And there's a bunch of other sort of options for it. In terms of the way we think of drone intelligence and drone capabilities and research areas around that, how does the naval domain, like the sea domain, differ from the type of artificial intelligence that would create a breakthrough in the air domain, for instance? And what are some of the other, when you think about it, and also who has an advantage here in terms of research, Russia or Ukraine? Russia can look at these things from a research perspective, but Ukraine it has a lot of access to Western research and interesting companies. But how does the creating a breakthrough, especially in terms of artificial intelligence, differ in the maritime domain than it does from the air domain?
Well, I think we have to recognize that since now we're talking about AI and autonomy, that artificial intelligence runs on data. So whoever has most data, most diverse data, most heterogeneous data, data that's directly relevant to combat and to future combat capabilities, whoever has that type of information is going to, if not have an advantage, because obviously everybody's doing the same thing, but will have enough information at their fingertips to try and train their algorithms to do what they need them to do. And late last year, Ukraine announced that it has gathered enough battlefield data from all of its sensors, all of its drones, imagery that was taken from the air, from space, on the ground, social media, you name it. I think it's something like 2 centuries worth of data from the past 3 years of conflict. And so that massive data tranche is now going to be used to train artificial intelligence algorithms to essentially navigate in modern combat, whether that's aerial, ground, or maritime combat. I'm convinced that Russians have done the same with respect to their data. They've announced years ago, and Patrick, you and I have talked about this, that they're going to use artificial intelligence for data analysis and decision-making capacity. So Russians obviously have been collecting a lot of battlefield data as well from all of their sensors, and they've probably collected massive amounts as well. So we know a little less about Russian capabilities because they stopped talking about them publicly. We know a little more about Ukrainian capabilities because there are some public sources and Ukrainian officials that are on the record. But suffice it to say, both sides are racing to acquire as much information as possible to feed that data to AI algorithms to make their technologies more effective. And I think a lot does depend on the terrain, because ground terrain in Ukraine is this nightmarish environment where even well-experienced soldiers and commanders can get lost and can be in a position to make mistakes. Maritime domain is a little simpler in that regard, but maritime domain is all about distance and how to deliver that information over distance, or how to have these systems operate at a significant distance from the operator. And I think this is where artificial intelligence can be quite helpful. And again, it will depend on the data analytical capabilities of both belligerents.
So I like on that, just a follow up, because this is also something that I've observed Ukraine talking about, and it's something that we've talked about Russia talking about as well. And for the first time, the difference between right now and World War I is that you have the ability to automatically structure and collect massive data sets from the battlefield that have never existed before. And obviously that must have a tremendous amount of relevance. And I think that if I remember, the Ukrainians were talking about that in the context of trying to highlight the value that they bring to Western defense contractors and the value of this data as a way to solicit, partners. You might want to think again when you try and discount the value of Ukrainian battle experience, because this is the stuff that's really relevant. But I also wonder, what do you think this data, because if I'm thinking about battlefield data from Ukraine, and maybe I'm just not being sufficiently imaginative here, but it's sort of like we talk about China as having this massive data set that's going to really sort of terrify everybody because they can apply AI to it. And a lot of that data set are just pictures of ethnically Han Chinese people walking around China that they use for facial recognition in order to pursue their own police policies. It's not like necessarily stuff that is broader than that. And when I think of Ukrainian data from the battlefield, I'm thinking, hey, this Russian soldier used to be here and is now not. Like, give me, but I don't think I'm being like imagined enough. I just don't have a really good window into it. What is this data that's emerging from the battlefield that's different from like what we can all kind of see from our phones?
I think if we look at what's available to us on social media, if we look at videos from drones, right, we see this nightmarish environment of half destroyed or almost completely destroyed buildings with entire villages and towns essentially as combat ranges. We see lots of different types of debris and rubble. We see similar looking combatants on both sides, similar looking technologies on both sides. We see environment that has been severely damaged by war, which is adding more and more layers and data layers to how to essentially the ability or inability to navigate through that. So if you're creating a data set, for example, for an unmanned ground vehicle that has to navigate through this type of environment, you better have a lot of data points lined up for that UGV to identify as it passes through, because even experienced humans can be lost or they can make a mistake as they try to move around. And we've seen videos like that, soldiers basically coming at point blank at each other because they thought that the soldiers they saw were from their unit. They're in fact the adversary. So how do you navigate that very uncertain environment that can change on a daily basis? You can look at the video from yesterday and it will look a certain way, and then there were multiple strikes in the same area today and it looks completely different, with more potholes, with more rubble and other types of other types of data points that form that environment. So it is a constantly changing environment, and now as Ben indicated earlier, there's lots of fiber optic cable on the ground as well. That's adding to all of this. Even experienced commanders on both sides can be at a loss occasionally in this environment. So the more data you have, that can be compared against other data, similar data, the better educated you're going to be. And we'll never actually make a system as intelligent as a human that would be able to intuitively understand what it is seeing. But we can probably at some point in the future come close to enabling a specific autonomous weapon to probably analyze an environment to a certain degree of certainty and hopefully make the right decision.
Yeah. And I guess it didn't even occur to me until I just said it out loud, but obviously a lot of the data that emerges from that place is stuff we can't see because one of the most dynamic aspects of that battlefield is the electromagnetic spectrum, which is the thing that's forcing like so much of this stuff. And so we're learning new things like literally about the edge of physics all the time because of these folks' experiences and how to manipulate and change that in the context of modern, highly electrified communications, heavy warfare. And yeah, but it's fascinating when you think about it. It's certainly very terrifying because, one of the questions that I always have when I think about these things is what is the level of like human accountability when we start to plan highly autonomous combat operations? Like who's the person that gets fired when the drone drops the thermal bomb on the wrong place? And if it's a Western military, like it's Ukrainian military, there's a person that's in a chain of command, and regardless of how the thing was programmed, there's a person that's responsible if they pick the wrong thing, if they screw up. Like that's just a very Western way of doing things. And in the Russian military, the chain of command is very different, right? Because it's much more sort of top down, much less, fewer NCOs that have more autonomy to make their own decisions. And so the person that's higher up on the chain of command, who maybe initiated some autonomous action of drones, they're going to be insulated from accountability in part because of the lower degree of value that the Russian government under Vladimir Putin places on human life. But also there'll be fewer people to sort of complain about it too. So that creates not necessarily more intelligent artificial intelligence, but it does broaden the spectrum of stuff they can use it for. Because if you want to be cruel and crude and stupid, then you have more options in warfare. Unfortunately, I don't know. What do you think of that? Do you see any? How do you see that on the battlefield in terms of some of the decisions around drone use? Like we talk all the time about people in some of these villages that live in a constant state of terror as Russia's now kind of playing like a horrifying killer robot like sniper game with them. But that's not necessarily something that comes directly from the top of the Russian military. How do you see some of the decisions between Ukrainian commanders and Russian commanders in terms of the use of these things? And what does that contrast tell you about which approach to drone warfare is, regardless of which one we might prefer from a human standpoint, from a law standpoint, which one is actually more effective?
Well, look, there's a lot in that we don't know. There's a lot of it that we don't really see all the time. The little public information we have on how both sides are utilizing their drone forces are obviously for public consumption. I remember several Ukrainian officials on the record with respect to AI ethics saying that their number one goal is to ensure that Ukraine can win and that they can safeguard their country. And when it comes to the autonomous weapons, yes, there's obviously a concern, but they need to win first and talk about ethics second. That doesn't mean that they're not concerned about ethics as they are racing to develop autonomous systems. But again, it's about victory, and it's about the first priority, which is the safety and security of Ukraine and its people. On the Russian side, there's been a lot of talk about ethics as well. Prior to this round of warfare, prior to 2022, you and I talked about this. I've written about it in Defense One as well. There's been a lot of debate and discussion about ethics in AI for Russians because they too are concerned that this technology can be abused quite quickly. And a lot of concern was actually voiced by people in the Russian government and in the Russian parliament. But this war is rewriting a lot of things, that is rewriting a lot of previous assumptions. And I think both sides are racing towards the outcome and towards the result. So ethics is very important when it comes to AI development, but it often takes second seat to accomplishing the mission and the goal. And I think the sentiment before the war started was that if Russians were to develop an autonomous system, they would just put it in combat because there wouldn't be as many checks and balances in the Russian government and society towards fielding those systems as exist in the West or in countries that want to ally with the West.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that it's a really good point. And I think it's something that obviously when I talk to people, not necessarily on the record, but at some point of command authority in the US military, they also reinforce the point that, yeah, they're really cognizant of ethics, but we're not going to lose a war because of a particular interpretation of ethics. That's not a thing that it's their job to allow happen. That's a sort of a universal feeling. Ukraine is defending its own territory and not launching drones at like downtown St. Petersburg in the way that the Russian military is. And so that creates just basically the decision of where you're going to go and do these things creates an entirely different kind of ethical frame. But yeah, to your point, I definitely also see a lot of Ukrainian use of autonomy and in drones and in drone warfare in a way that were it happening somewhere else, we would be a little bit freaked out because you're talking about like large open spaces and they're defending often and they're defending their own territory. We talk about it using different words, but these are the same considerations that are going to happen the next time there's large scale use of drones in some sort of urban warfare setting. And I think to a certain extent, you can sort of say the same of what we're seeing in Gaza, where a lot of people are sort of horrified. And the question is, well, in that situation, is part of our horror the fact that like the scale of whole-scale destruction, and would greater, more intelligence in these weapons decrease it or increase it? And that actually just depends on the will and the whim and the intent of the people leading the war. And so that's really the most important thing. But the technology itself is neutral. It's just confined to those things.
Well, Sam, my final question to you before we let you go. Last you and I spoke, unmanned ground robots were seemingly irrelevant thanks to the varied terrain that they had to overcome versus, I think as you pointed out earlier, the ease of travel and flight, for example. And similar to what you had brought up a moment ago, I noticed that you'd posted about one ground robot that it's been used for medical missions. It has 16 different connection access points to help navigate uneven roads or routes. And to me, that sounds super intriguing and kind of gives me hope that I might one day be able to get my hands on like a drone lawnmower so I don't have to do it myself. Are there any other intriguing twists or recent developments in the ground robot domain from this conflict that you have observed? Because we haven't really gotten into this too much just yet.
When we last spoke sometime in 2023, as tactical drones were basically controlling the battlefield in Ukraine, it became more and more difficult for soldiers, for vehicles to navigate and remain safe from these UAVs. And so lots of UGVs that were still considered for application that were developed by Russians before 2022 were relatively expensive systems full of expensive sensors. And I think in early 2023, one of them, I think that I've written about that for Defense One, the marker UGV that was supposedly enabled with AI were given to frontline soldiers and units for testing and evaluation. And then we heard nothing. So it's not that they were irrelevant, it's that they were not really ready for or built for the type of conflict that Ukraine combat has evolved into. What we're seeing now, fast forward into 2025, are multiple small, cheap, attritable platforms, also built with commercial components or fully from commercial parts, which have modular structure that can carry lots and lots of sensors, but they're small. They're not large, expensive UGVs built by Russians, for example, prior to 2022. And even though Russians apparently have tried out their Uran and Platforma and Nerekhta UGVs in limited conflicts, it was very quickly discovered that they have lots of issues because of their size, because of their communication capabilities and other vulnerabilities. And so today, on the front lines in Ukraine, on both sides, there's lots and lots of smaller UGVs that can fill the roles of soldiers and vehicles for example, supply and delivery, for medical evacuations, for light combat missions, for one-way kamikaze attacks, for mining and demining, and for carrying other equipment such as electronic warfare and other systems. Again, these are smaller, cheap, and attritable systems, probably no larger than the table that's behind Patrick right now in his office. So these are relatively small. They can maybe carry one human. They can carry several hundred kilos if necessary, but they're not expensive to put together. They're not expensive to maintain. And if lost, they should be and often are quickly replaced. Russian Defense Minister Belousov, who, by the way, is relatively new now, if we compare this conversation with 2023, so he replaced Defense Minister Shoigu, he remarked several months ago that the best UGVs he saw are the ones that soldiers put together themselves on the front lines. So there's a lot of that DIY type of activity, the do-it-yourself type of activity from commercial parts and components and whatever's available in your garage or essentially in your fingertips that goes into the development of these UGVs. But even those simple, cheap, and attritable systems can help develop certain tactics. And now they're more and more used with UAVs for command and control. They're used with UAVs for attacks, such as by Ukrainian units that have struck Russian positions and forced a surrender of Russian positions and soldiers via a combination of UGVs and UAVs, and Russians are learning the same as well. But this entire UGV space in the war in Ukraine looks very different from the one that we witnessed that was essentially in development prior to 2022. And that space was dominated by larger, expensive systems that could be quite intimidating on the battlefield because they were developed in the absence of the ubiquitous tactical drone threat that actually defines the conflict in Ukraine. And we should add, is starting to define other conflicts around the world, where technologies seen in Ukraine are actually rapidly proliferating around the world. And now we see radio-controlled FPVs, fiber optic drones in conflicts in Latin America, Africa, Middle East, South and Southeast Asia, because it is relatively cheap and quick to build and acquire these systems. So there's still lots of UGVs. There's lots of experimentation that's taking place in Russia, in Ukraine with respect to those systems, but they look markedly different than those that were conceived prior to 2022.
Yeah, can I just like a real quick follow-up? Because I'm curious, he's relatively new in the tenure of Russian defense ministers. Do you see any big difference qualitatively between Belousov and Shoigu in terms of their approach to warfare in general? I don't know, their loyalty to and from Putin. What's the most important difference between the two of them?
Well, obviously, both are very loyal to Putin, otherwise they wouldn't be where they are. But Belousov comes from the commercial civilian background. Unlike Shoigu didn't serve in the military. He was in the Russian equivalent of FEMA, which is sort of a semi-paramilitary force in and of itself, but he's been in the military long enough to have that uniform, fit him. But Belousov comes from the commercial background, and he comes from a background where he often engaged with and accepted the problems that exist in the Russian industry when it comes to, for example, a domestic UAV development. Belousov also understood very quickly that he needs to engage, he as in the Ministry of Defense, needs to engage with lots and lots of volunteer and technical startups that have sprung up very quickly in Russia to support the war effort. We can do a separate podcast just on that. In fact, multiple podcasts. Because if you look at my social media feeds, probably like 80% of that is devoted to that specific development of the war, the evolution of this sort of non-military People's Military Industrial Complex, or People's VPK, as the Russian acronym goes. And so Belousov understood the need to engage with these developments and promote them and establish relationships between established defense enterprises and these new technical startups, which is an entirely new phenomenon for Russia as a country, for Russian military in particular. And that's probably one of the largest distinctions we can draw right now. It's not that Shoigu was ignoring those developments. It's that he was busy propping up significant losses in the Russian military as it tried to inch forward against Ukrainian forces. So Belousov has a bit of a more technical background in that regard, and he understands the importance of high tech at the tactical edge, as well as the overall military picture in Ukraine writ large.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for answering that. I totally think that it is worth another podcast, but I mean, so are so many things. That's the only problem.
Of course.
Yeah.
Hey, Sam Bendett, thanks so much for talking with us. I really appreciate it. I'm going to continue conversation with Patrick as soon as I let you go.
Thanks so much.
Awesome. Take care.
All right. Bye, guys.
Bye.
All right, Patrick. How's it going, buddy?
Great. Oh, my gosh. So exciting. Department of War, man. Wow. So much war.
Yeah, Secretary of War, Sal.
Yeah, that's right, Sal. Someone must have said something. I saw him on Instagram, and they hashtagged SecWar, and I'm like, yeah, I know, you guys are trying to dodge the Sal thing pretty good, which you should do, because Sal sounds kind of dumb, but no, I'm great. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm good. Yeah, I mean, the question with this one, drones, Ukraine, it really was kind of like where to begin. And I did tell Sam that you had been to Camp Atterbury. And that I told him a bit about that. He knew a bit more about it than I have. I told him I misunderstood and thought you were taking that trip later this month, so I'm catching up on it. But you reported during that trip on, apparently, the way our headline put it, on Pentagon plans to, quote, Americanize drone warfare.
Yeah.
So aside from seeming like a branding effort from a very brand-conscious administration, what exactly does Americanized drone warfare look like? Tell our listeners and tell us about this trip you took.
Well, in keeping with the proud American tradition of finding good ideas someplace else, ripping them off, and then scaling them up in terms of investment and hype, it's pretty much Ukrainian drone warfare. So it is inspired, this new push, it comes from both the Defense Secretary himself and is now being enacted by the Undersecretary for Research and Engineering, Emil Michael. It is essentially takes all of the things that you see that we just talked about in terms of Ukraine's drone warfare, where you have innovators that are like literally on the front lines. You have soldiers, but you also have a handful of companies. They're sending stuff at each other from the Russian side and the Ukrainian side because of electronic warfare, because of some new adaptation or innovation. It's getting shot down, and the innovators on the front line are taking it back, rewiring it almost immediately. One of the other things that happens in Ukraine is that battlefield commanders have much more authority to just buy whatever the heck they need themselves. And that really gets them out of having to have an acquisition system that goes from the Ukrainian MOD, which would be far too long and just arduous in the context of what's happening there right now. So it is a system where there is much more authority that's placed on commanders, much more power and autonomy to make not just decisions about training and how to achieve a specific objective, but also just like what to actually get, cutting the paperwork. This is something that the Defense Department now has really made kind of a focus of their new approach to acquisition. And they do mention drones when they do it, like it's very much connected to drones. And also, that thing that we mentioned where there is a new emphasis on like continuous experimentation and having like the door open as opposed to big like set programs of record. The U.S. Army is going to buy 50,000 of these zippy dappy do drones. They will all come from Raytheon as the prime. They will all be the same until the next testing iteration, and we're just going to buy them like that. Instead, it is much more like you see in Ukraine, where if you are if you've got a garage drone, you can figure out how to get into one of these testing things. You can work with other companies, and also you can work with actual operators to see if what you have and what you're building fits into the way they're thinking about war, and you can get a move on. So it really models a lot of what's happening in Ukraine. But there are some really big differences, though. And that is that Ukraine, much of this drone warfare that we see in Ukraine, particularly the innovation that's happening, where you're putting more autonomy on the platform, where you have fiber optics, like you're using fiber optics as a means to bypass electromagnetic warfare. That is because they live in an environment, they're working in an environment where they just don't have good control of the spectrum. Neither side does. And one of the things, and so you don't really have comms in the same way that you would expect to. And one of the things that the Defense Department is really focused on is making sure that, yeah, we totally want to take a bunch of these lessons on innovation, but the other thing we really want to have is like actual layered methods of communication and intelligence gathering with all of these things. So we were talking a moment ago about the role of drones in like ISR, and what the Pentagon is trying to put together through by seeing which vendors have these things, letting them come in and experiment and move out on it, is developing entirely new concepts for getting large mesh networks, little families of drones and operators to actually talk to each other, share information, and execute some of those maneuvers we see in Ukraine, but far better. Like basically take the whole idea of joint all-domain command and control, which was like an expensive theoretical thing for a long time, and make it real, like kind of on the ground. And you do that by building in just lots and lots of really layered applying AI to lots of different ways for things, little ground robots, we were talking about that, satellites, manned aircraft, unmanned things, everybody in the theater, little soldier-borne sensors, little things that people carry around with them. Everybody, we're talking about battlefield data, taking the value of that data that exists in Ukraine now and just scaling it up so that you can actually just, force multiply your little drone force. Like now your little drone force is exponentially more effective because it actually does have comms. Those comms are giving it a much better understanding of the entire world as it's changing. And that includes, things back to what the supply line in Russia is now doing to adapt to what you just did, how you adapt your supply line, and just building out predictive intelligence to increase both the accuracy and the tempo of things on the battlefield, but also on the long end of that, recreating and redrafting strategies and options in real time based on what's happening. So it's basically the Ukrainian drone war, except with all the things that America can now like afford. So if you were gonna, it's sort of the way I think about it is like you play ever like Sim City or Age of Empires or something like that, The Sims.
I can imagine what you're talking about. The only closest I came was Civilization. That's
yeah. It. Okay. So like, I got sort of impatient with it pretty quick, but I really liked it when I could play on cheat mode, where I just had unlimited. Yeah, exactly. Where you had like unlimited resources.
I feel like the president is that way as well.
Yeah. So pretty much. But it's basically the vision that they have is the everything that Ukraine has been able to do in drone warfare, playing the same game, except they want a cheat code to allow them to do the same bunch of stuff, just much faster and much better and more accurate.
Well, I wonder, as you're talking about this, I wondered about the question of attritability. Did the U.S. become more comfortable with attritable systems? Because previously it was kind of like, this is so secret, we can't let it fall into the hands of insurgent group X or whatever. Is this like leeway that they're giving folks now, this more, compatible format with Ukraine's combat? Do you think there's an issue with attritability or sensitive technology where it's less of a concern than it was previously? It's less secretive. There are so many. So what if you find one? We got another 5,000 coming around the bend. Is that kind of a consideration? Or is, I may cut this question, but I was wondering as you're talking about it, there does seem like a marked attitude, and maybe this is the reason the U.S. was so slow to pivot Maybe there's many reasons. There probably are. Why the U.S. was so slow to pivot to drones. They're like, why did the U.S. suddenly get left behind? And Hegseth does his little image with his little video he does where he's like, we're going to do drones. And then has to like take the soundtrack off because he didn't get the rights to do Metallica or whatever was behind him. But they were obviously very excited about it, and and I did wonder.
Okay.
I wondered if part of it was like this different attitude towards expendability in the technology that they have now, because it's not this super secret thing anymore.
Yeah. No, I think they sort of got the memo after what happened in Ukraine that you can't just have. And they also began to look at what actually is going to go into a peer adversary conflict environment, because we've had. I mean, we're the ones that really brought combat drones out to be a thing. Like, they didn't invent them, but we really mainstreamed it. And how did that happen? War on terror, right? Our Middle Eastern wars, where we reinvented drone warfare along a very specific parameter. Rich Little writes about this in his fantastic book. We had to create a drone that could fire a Hellfire missile on command from in the Middle East, in Iraq or Afghanistan, on command instantaneously in real time from a trailer that's sitting on the CIA campus in Langley, Virginia. Because you couldn't run the command from Germany, because the Germans didn't like it, and you couldn't run it from anywhere else in the Middle East. You had to have the thing talk to the CIA on the ground. And that's how we think of like drone warfare for a long time. And then you watch what was happening in Ukraine, where, you know what? Actually, we don't need any more like a massive satellite communications web to do drone warfare. That's stupid. You can just send them up now and have them like shoot at things. And we realized the replicator program sort of speaks to this. We realized that we really have to start thinking of these things much more like bullets. It really kind of came out of Indo-PACOM. Aquilino more than Paparo, who first started sort of like pushing for it. And OSD adopted this replicator program, but that too sort of showed how limited the Defense Department was in actually achieving that, like achieving attributability and mass at scale, because everyone talked about it like it was a good idea, but it was a pathfinder, and it didn't produce that many drones. Like, Ukraine's delivered 1 million drones to its frontline operators this year, and the goal of replicator was like a few 100,000 in like 5 years, and everyone was like, why can't you guys just do this? Why can't you guys just do this? So I think that that's created a kind of a sense of how far behind on this we really are, and there are a lot of reasons. But one of them, as you point out, the thing is, we got to start pushing towards attritability, but that's never going to be our advantage in the event that we are in a conflict with China. China's going to out-attributable us on freaking drones. They own the magnets. Like, they are the supply line for the entire like global consumer drone industry. And we're trying to recapture a little bit of that as much as we can, but we're not going to out-attributable them. We have to get much more attributable, but I think you also get a sense that we have to find our advantage in a lot of other places, because just mass isn't going to do it like enough. But if we don't get a lot more attributable, I know it's so hard to say.
Attritable. I know
attritable.
Attributable.
If we don't get more attritable, without greater attritability in the near future, we surely shall soon see the Jerrys on the lawn.
Well, your point does sort of make me think, it doesn't feel to me like it's smart to engage with any conflict with China anytime soon. It feels like, I mentioned in a meeting recently, it feels more like we're going to poke around with some lower peer fighters somewhere, maybe down around the Caribbean, or maybe even just our
down,
friends
down and around our block, like maybe down and around like
Ottawa.
Yeah.
I'm joking, of course, but I'm only half joking. But it does. Yeah. I mean, the point is, the U.S. not quite the leader, trying to catch up, and you've got this administration that wants to project toughness, and so they're going to grab the issue. And so, did you leave Camp Atterbury, this drone experience, feeling things were on a smarter footing, or simply that it was on the same kind of, hopefully get it incrementally smarter than it was last year, same kind of position it's been for, it seems like, the last half decade or so? Did you feel like the momentum is different, or the momentum is quite similar to what we already kind of have known with this slow evolution of the U.S. adopting smaller drone technology for combat?
Oh yeah, no, I actually did walk away really kind of reassured and encouraged and kind of really very impressed by some of the stuff that was coming out of it because there's policy stuff, but one of the things that's actually very smart about the new direction that they're taking, which builds on a direction that the Defense Department was taking before, but it really kind of accelerates it a little further. And there have been a lot of people pushing for that for a long time, but it's really nice to see the barriers removed. Yeah, when you have now, the Marines have come out with a concept of actual operations for drone warfare, and they're beginning to actually like do this stuff. You have kind of a doors wide open plan for anybody that has a new configuration, a new idea can come in and sort of test it out. And you really do have some capabilities that come from the U.S. information technology sector that have never been used in the context of like a modern conflict that can be used in the context of this one. And that includes like applying new AI solutions to all of this stuff to achieve some of the stuff that I just talked about. So it is a problem that that China makes so many parts of drones and capabilities. But no, if you actually go out and you talk to people every day that are, and they also, though there's, I guess, maybe some folks in the West Wing that don't necessarily like to highlight it, but the United States military, like military to military, has some really great relationships with the Ukrainians, and that's something that some other folks in the West Wing have begun to now appreciate a little bit more and to highlight a little bit more. We have, if you take all the advantages that we have, you actually put them together. And you take a moment to say like, oh, there was just a lot of weird bureaucratic stuff that was in the way that prevented us from even attempting to create like mass-produced drones on this scale. Then you begin to see like a new picture taking place. We're not going to talk about this stuff anymore in terms of like a raw number of drones means you won. It's going to be about developing a capability that brings in a lot of different aspects of technology to bear on a problem on some sort of problem. And if you're doing it right, then yes, war with China is scary. But I do honestly think that it is very much to our advantage that war with us seem at least as scary to them. And it's something that we can do. I think that the problem is that, everyone doesn't understand all of that yet because we're too busy talking about, everyone doesn't understand all that yet because thank God we're not actually in a war. That we have a little bit of time to put this together and create an entirely new approach to warfare that employs robotics, that employs frontline innovation, constant reinvention, all of the actual cool, like high-end capability stuff that we have, like really robust information technology sector that's both consumer-facing and increasingly government-facing, really good understanding of how to apply AI to stuff coming off the battlefield. You have commanders. We have an authority structure in terms of non-commissioned officers that has shown itself to be a huge advantage for the Ukrainians, the lack of which was a huge freaking problem for the Russians. China does not have a strong NCO corps that's been to war a bunch, like we do. And so we have a ton of advantages that we can actually put together here. So the thing that does give me hope is that it's just the same thing that usually does. It's all these people that are actually making stuff. And I was encouraged that now they actually do have feel some support and they're putting together something that is long overdue. I think it's fair to say, and it's not necessarily there's nothing that's particularly like one side or the other side from one OSD head from one head of that department to the other. That's not a thing. There's been political momentum building for that for forever in the sense of politics as a decision of how we as a public make things, not as a pitched fight. This is something that a lot of people have been talking about as overdue, and now it's finally happening. And I think that probably is something that, well, at least in my case, I find it reassuring and pretty cool, actually.
Defense One Science and Tech editor Patrick Tucker, thanks so much for talking to me. I really appreciate it, as usual.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for talking to me. We'll talk to you next time.
Adios.
Adios. War! Okay.
Well, that's it for us this episode. Thanks for listening. And until next time.
On the front lines, every decision matters. That's why Intel partnered with EdgeRunner AI to bring AI where and when our troops need it most, in the field, in real time. EdgeRunner's secure, domain-specific language model is optimized to run on Intel-powered devices, and it's built on Intel's 50-year commitment to advanced manufacturing right here on American soil. That's the power of Intel Inside. See what we can build together at intel.com/USAI.